Art Nouveau is when it looks made by elves, and Art Deco is when it looks made by dwarves. This video goes out to all the internet imps, network gnomes, and HTT pukas who have come across this post at some point in their journey through the other world and immediately understood its truth. And also to the lovely commenter who directly requested it. How did we come to develop an almost canonical material culture for two fictional societies? Elves characterized by delicate organic shapes, and dwarves by rigid geometric forms. To answer this question, we're going to have to deconstruct a series of contemporary cliches and dive into how fiction and folklore provide the thematic ingredients that shape the look and feel of modern fantasy. What do elves and dwarves mean to us? What cultural beliefs do they represent? And what narrative purpose do they serve in our stories that we continue to perpetuate these tropes across film, gaming, and literary media? And how have those identities crystallized into a persistent and recognizable visual language? One quick note is that I am going to skip the Keebler or Christmas elf typology and really focus on the high elf from modern fantasy. I'm actually going to structure this video a little differently today, so instead of just lecturing at you, I invite you to do a little workshop with me. Let's pretend that we're designing the look of elves and dwarves from scratch. I'm going to give you a little crash course in art direction where we'll learn how to generate key themes and translate those abstract ideas into images. At the end of our discussion, we may come to understand how Art Nouveau and Art Deco provide very narratively appropriate design handles for Elven and Dwarven culture. So let's head to our first stop, the creative brief. Professionally, I have been an art director and graphic designer for over a decade. And whenever I undertake a new branding project, I always make sure that I have a creative brief before I start any kind of concepting or sketching. This document is your North Star for any creative undertaking. It outlines the goals of the campaign or artifact, the intended audience, and the key attributes of the brand so that you have an agreed upon direction for the ultimate product. In my own practice, I really strip back my creative briefs to focus on that last part, which is the brand values. Sometimes clients come really prepared and they have a whole positioning statement ready, like Winky Dinks is a family-friendly corn dog franchise with a focus on fun flavors at an accessible price point so every day can taste like summer. Okay, so I totally improvised that, but then wanted to double check that Winky Dinks wasn't an actual business just in case. But lo and behold, there is an actual Winky Dinky hot dog establishment. You know you're a master of your craft when you can brand hot dogs in your sleep. But sometimes folks really struggle to generate these kinds of descriptions. They're often really great at describing what their business does, but have a hard time articulating how it should make people feel. So a tool that can help is to offer people a series of opposing adjectives to kind of get them in the zone. Is the brand sophisticated or lowbrow? Is it austere or approachable? Trustworthy or shifty? You can get really evocative or even a little silly with it. Like, if you had to choose, would your brand be squishy or sharp? Fuzzy or smooth? Clear or opaque? You get the idea. All of these words will give you a foothold for a visual approach later on. When it comes to world building, I think we can use a very similar process to design our fantasy societies. We can ask in-world questions like, who are these people? What are their values? How are their values either shaped by or reflected in their environment? And we can ask meta questions like, what narrative purpose does this society serve in my story? Does the protagonist's interaction with this culture highlight something about his or her character or offer an opportunity for growth? Do these people have unique access to a special resource, like ancient knowledge or a magical artifact that is pivotal to the plot? Once you have answers for these questions, I think that you'll naturally start to get a mental image of this society, which will lend itself to a tangible material culture. So let's get back to elves and dwarves and take a stab at answering these questions based on what we know about them from centuries of fiction and folklore. In contemporary fantasy, elves and dwarves often serve as narrative foils to illustrate key themes or to enrich character relationships through conflict. We can attribute much of this clear distinction to J.R.R. Tolkien, though he no doubt drew his own inspiration from the Elfar of Norse mythology. In the Prose Edda, the light elves, or Ljósálfar, are described as fairer than the sun to look at. They dwell in Elfheime, ruled by the god Freyr, who represents peace, prosperity, fertility, and a bountiful harvest. By contrast, the dark elves, or Dökulfar, dwell down in the earth, and they are unlike in appearance, but by far more unlike in nature. The dark elves are blacker than pitch. Some scholars posit that Dökulfar may actually be synonymous with the term Svartalfar, which in the sources appears to be also interchangeable with Dvergr, the Norse dwarf. The Dvergr were renowned as blacksmiths and craftsmen, and also kind of famously jerks. Interestingly, there isn't really a consensus on what they looked like. Sometimes they were as tall as humans, sometimes small like gnomes, sometimes hairless, sometimes furred. That's folklore for you. It's also been suggested that Christian influence on native mythology may have produced this dichotomy between light and dark elves, similar to the angels and their fallen counterparts. Though it's important to remember that good versus evil dualism is not unique to Christian theology. So, going back to our creative brief, we can position elves and dwarves as a study in contrast to great narrative effect. How does each embody or investigate themes like the aristocrat or the worker, the other or the familiar, the natural or the industrial? Let's go through each of these themes one at a time. In most contemporary fantasy, elves are portrayed as noble, sequestered, and refined. Literary description of their society tends to center their art, music, and other elements of high culture, rather than their labor or industry. Like, Tolkien makes no mention of elven agriculture outside of a few obscure passages in the history of Middle-earth, but there's so much singing.
Elvish singing is not a thing to miss.
Tra-la-la-lally, here down in the valley, ha-ha.
Elven elegance and detachment reflects the image of landed nobility, more concerned with legacy, beauty, and balance than the pedestrian business of daily survival. Much like real-world elites, they are often out of touch with the world outside their mystic cities, aloof and patronizing toward lesser beings and their petty causes. Dwarves, by contrast, are a people defined by their works, most commonly depicted as artisans, miners, builders, and warriors. Today, they are associated with values like loyalty, pride, and pragmatism, though in addition to inheriting craftsmanship from the Dvergr myth, modern dwarves are similarly uncouth and greedy, often led to their demise by avarice. Perhaps because of this fatal flaw, I feel like fiction rarely gives us a dwarven society that is in its prime. They are the perfect vehicle for the dared too greatly trope, whether from delving too deep or from forbidden invention. So most stories seem to depict dwarven kingdoms that are in some state of societal decay, a graveyard of abandoned cities and forgotten technology. Similarly, the high elf archetype can also be flipped, where perhaps they once ruled advanced, glittering empires, but through war or internal catastrophe have fallen to the status of slaves or vagrants, shadows of their former glory. Dwarves and elves share in otherness, their long lives and affinity for the supernatural, providing a contrast to human mortality and mundanity. Modern high elves inherit much of their eeriness and mystery from the Aescead of Irish mythology. These supernatural beings were said to be descended from the Tuatha Dé Danann, Ireland's ancient gods, and they held according power. Though they interact with the mortal world, they come from the other world, a supernatural realm described sometimes as a paradise of everlasting youth and beauty, and sometimes as a spiritual retreat and land of the dead. Reflecting the character of their environment, the Aescead were often thought to be exquisitely beautiful, strong, immortal, but also frightening, enigmatic, and dangerous. They dispense both blessings and curses, steal babies and lovers alike, but can be placated by gifts and respect of their sacred places. You can see how many features of the Aescead have been incorporated into modern high elves. Eerily beautiful, ancient beings who dwell in timeless realms, sometimes benevolent, often unsettling, and never quite safe. By contrast, dwarves are pretty relatable for a non-human race. They come across as grounded, literally and figuratively, given to common mortal vices like gold, women, and drink, while their stubbiness, hairiness, or grumpiness is often used for comedic effect. However, there is a sense of confidence undergirding dwarf culture and their commitment to honor and to the quality of their work. While often less inherently magical or powerful than elves, they feel as though they have a certainty of purpose, or at least stubbornness. These values perhaps serve to highlight humanity's uncertainty. We basically never know what we're doing or have the strength to do what needs to be done, and so our dwarven and elven allies provide the ancient wisdom, fine equipment, or supernatural skill to see the quest to its completion. Elves in the modern imagination are deeply tied to nature, owing to early modern European folklore that describes them as beings of the woods, glades, and other undisturbed places. As attitudes toward the forest changed over time, so did the character of elves. In the Middle Ages, when human settlements were fewer and the dangers of the wild were greater, earlier myths portrayed elves as mischievous or even menacing. In the Victorian era, with the rise of industrialization, a longing for a pastoral past shaped elf stories to reflect a more delicate, benevolent spirit. They represent life, light, all that blooms, and are often characterized as guardians or stewards of the natural world. By contrast, dwarves tend to have a more utilitarian relationship with nature. Closely associated with mountains, caves, and the deep earth, the gift of their environment is not life, but resources. With the treasures of the earth, they craft deft tools, keen weapons, and great stone halls. To dwarves, nature is not spirit, but substance. While elves seek to preserve a pristine natural order, dwarves reshape and refine nature through labor and craftsmanship. Both races symbolize a reverence for the earth, but to elves it is a work of art. To dwarves, it is a fuel for industry. So now that we've collected a series of thematic ingredients, how do we combine it together for a visual language? Let's unpack it piece by piece. Aristocracy brings to mind objects that feel fine, dainty, maybe even fragile. There's no clearer announcement of privilege than owning breakable things that must be painstakingly crafted, carefully protected, and potentially replaced. So delicacy is often a sign of refinement. By contrast, utilitarian aesthetics are typically associated with the working class. Motifs such as geometric shapes, straight lines, and thick forms often embody rationality, directness, and strength. To make an object feel otherworldly, we must identify what it is to look made by human hands. Usually, that's imperfection, a mark left by the hammer, a slight mismatch of elements, a brush stroke that shows the fallible hand of the maker. So it follows that objects which look supernatural also appear flawless. Maybe the surfaces are a little too smooth, or the complexity of the shapes seem impossible for the technology or materials of the setting to reasonably achieve. To evoke nature, we can borrow images directly from the green world. Think twisting vines, swaying leaves, or budding flowers. Curving shapes and fluid gestures also tend to feel more organic than straight lines or jagged edges. But those are exactly the devices we can use to portray industry. Think mathematical, mechanical, rigid, and sturdy. Taking a step back to review our work, I think you can see how Art Nouveau and Art Deco are perfect matches for our creative brief. Art Nouveau was a visual movement that rose to a peak of popularity from 1890 to 1910, a reaction against prevailing conventions that emphasized imitation of classical works and strict adherence to rigid academic realism. It rejected the rise of industrialization and sought to preserve a sense of handmade craftsmanship and uniqueness in the face of increasing mass production. The style is characterized by organic forms and flowing lines, often incorporating natural motifs like plants and animals. Despite man-made materials like iron, glass, or ceramics, its delicacy gives the impression of art that was somehow grown rather than built. And that's a very Elven energy, graceful, enchanting, and deeply connected to nature. The Golden Age of illustration, a period where the proliferation of mass publication created a voracious appetite for commercial art, also coincided with the height of Art Nouveau, such that many classic fairy tale anthologies were steeped in the style. There are artists like Arthur Rackham, Kay Nielsen, and Walter Crane. Art Deco, on the other hand, embraced rather than rejected the social changes wrought by industrialization. Rising to popularity in the 1920s and 30s, and a direct successor in opposition to Art Nouveau, the movement reflected an optimism for the transformative power of technology. While it contained several sometimes conflicting styles, overall it is characterized by geometry, symmetry, and splendor. Art Deco features bold lines, sharp angles, and stylized patterns, drawing its inspiration both from ancient artworks and lustrous modern materials like chrome, gold, ebony, and marble. It is the perfect match for Dwarven culture, with its values of strength, precision, and order reflected in its almost mathematical beauty. Even the materials feel appropriate for a culture whose primary resources are metal and stone. So there you have it, a 10-minute rant about a 2-sentence Tumblr post. I hope that the next time you read, watch, or maybe even design a fantasy setting yourself, you go through this deconstruction process in your head to assess how well the narrative devices are working. I don't think viewing media through a critical lens makes it less fun, but rather gives you a new way to enjoy it. When you understand how something was built and why it was made that way, it gives you a whole new dimension with which to engage with the thing you love. So get out there and shamelessly, affectionately judge. As always, thank you so much for watching. I make content about history, art, and fashion, probing at the why behind visual choices and what effect that has on our real or fictional culture. And if that sounds like your kind of nerd party, I hope you'll stick around, like, and subscribe. So until next time, stay shiny.